Hi, it's Kit Alowitz with another Leadership Journey video segment. Today I have two guests that I'm delighted that have joined me in the studio to talk about this idea of institutionalization, a deeper cut. We have Marisol Sanchez, Anderson Hauser's legal counsel. We also have Dr. Matthew Chodkowski with the University of Indianapolis. I welcome both of you to our studio today. We've been learning about institutionalization for nearly 2.5 years now via the 3 I's, that being internalization, integration, and finally institutionalization. And most of our attention over those 2.5 years has really been on this idea of internalizing principles on a personal level, and then at some point turning those principles towards integration at a team level, and then we're considering this idea of transitioning through this concept of incubation, this period or chasm between integration and institutionalization. Institutionalization, for me personally, has proved somewhat elusive for a majority of my time on the journey, my own leadership journey. Then one night, Matt and I were sitting at Bob Evans, pounding the mashed potatoes and the yummy Bob Evans gravy and rifling through pots of coffee, kicking around this idea of the leadership journey. We were looking for connections and insights and evidence as a collective group, had we paid the price to potentially get closer to this idea of the 3rd I, or institutionalization. We also talked about being able to recognize that when it came, or what were some of the conditions or evidence or behavior or results that would allow us as a collective group to recognize that we were in fact moving towards the other end of the pendulum on the 3 I's. And I'd asked Matt that night if he had any more descriptors or words or phrases that he could share with me as to what institutionalization was or is, as I was looking for some corollaries. Now, Matt must have been on some kind of coffee amp that night, because that night he provided me with a small breakthrough that was very helpful to me. As Matt was rifling through other terms that institutionalization could also be synonymous with, things like collective collaboration, cognitive collaboration, cultural capacity, he then next said a phrase that caught me, and that was learning organization. That clicked for me. Now, the term clicked for me because I'd heard it from Peter Senge back in 1990 when I first read Peter Senge's work on this idea. The book is called The Fifth Discipline, and I really liked it, and it clicked with me. Now, The Fifth Discipline, this is not the Bruce Willis movie. That's Fifth Element. The Fifth Discipline by Peter Senge was interesting in terms of this idea of building a learning organization. Now, you could argue that we're not talking about a rocket science concept here. That being, we're talking about an organization having the capacity and the capability to learn. And in the book sense, Peter Senge breaks it down into 5 collective arenas. Now, on the flip side, this bad boy idea has been somewhat elusive for a majority of the organizations that are out there today. And as you've heard Matt talk about repeatedly, most organizations get right to the point of integration and then struggle to get onto institutionalization. The 5 disciplines for a learning organization, they take a very broad swath of what a learning organization is, but I'd like to just briefly share those with you to give you a sense of what we're talking about. So the first discipline, there must be a persistent pursuit by the people that make up the organization to go for what's called personal mastery or learning. My question to you is, are you one of those people in our organization? Discipline number 2, there must be a strong and wise sense of mental models in the heads of the critical mass of the employees within the organization. Now, I do think our organization has been given oodles of potential wise and tested mental models for us as a collective organization to come together on this idea. My question to you is, are you one of those people in our organization that has taken this gift and run with it? The third discipline is that there must be a shared vision. Vision being, where are we going as an organization? Do you know where we're going as an organization? The fourth discipline talks about there must be this idea of team learning. Let's call it functional and cross-functional learning. My question to you is, have you invested the energy, the desire, and the time to learn within your functional and cross-functional teams in terms of what is your obligation to institutionalize principles across our enterprise? And then finally, the fifth discipline is this. Do we have the critical mass of an organization that must come to the point where they know and think in terms of systems, aka IPO? And then my final question to you is, have you paid the price to think in terms of systems thinking? Okay, so again, this doesn't seem like rocket science. We are talking about getting an organization to learn in terms of 5 collective areas. And you might even say, duh. But that idea has really proved, again, elusive to the majority of organizations out there today. And we, Anderson-Hauser, are going to be one of the few organizations that's going to break through on this. And so we want to talk to you about it today. And I'm always thinking, why is it so difficult to get past this barrier? And I think I've landed on at least my own idea that it probably looks like something related to quadrant 2 factor. Quadrant 2, you remember, is the time management matrix. It's important. This idea of institutionalization is important, but it may not seem urgent. And anything that's not urgent but is important is always at the whim or the temptation of not following through. In fact, the data and the research available on us, what this looks like and feels like for an organization to be coined, arrived at a learning organization, is actually fairly thin. And Matt and I, and Matt's talked to a lot of us here, that the data to try to find and understand what it takes, because it's so elusive, is fairly thin. So since a learning organization is synonymous with institutionalization, we are saying that the same sort of shortage of data actually applies, and we're trying to figure it out. So you might argue that if an organization learns and then chooses to apply what they learn, the organization, in theory, should then stop doing stuff that is unproductive. You might even call it dumb. And then if that organization chooses to apply the principles, then the organization in turn should turn around and start doing stuff that is wise or isn't dumb. And thus, a learning organization, and thus my own personal fascination with this concept. Now, if I may add just one or two other things, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues to talk. You might say that perhaps the most compelling thing I'd like for you to consider as I share this idea of the learning organization, we talk about it amongst the three of us today, is to borrow one of the 64 lead principles that simply says this: no organization can change in the absence of personal transformation. That principle states, in fact, it means zero. There isn't anything that can happen in terms of organizational change in the absence of you and I having some sort of personal transformation. The change, institutionalization, and preeminence that we seek, it really begins with you. It begins with me. It begins with us individually, and then together going for this pursuit of becoming or being a learning organization. So I'm asking you to join the cause. Now, I'm curious, let me just take a break here and ask Matt, what's your reaction to this idea of the learning organization?
Oh, gee, Kit, your overview of the learning organization was really great. The learning organization concept fits in very well with the term institutionalization, because unless we truly understand it, it's just another labor-saving device for thinking. So what's the point? Well, organizational learning requires an organization of learners, and an organization of learners requires an organization of students. Now, what's so important about that? Well, as learners, we are all on the collaborative journey of discovery together, not looking for things that affirm or confirm what we already know, but looking for things that confront and even challenge what we already know. And as students, we must possess the humility to admit that we have a lot more to learn and the courage to prove ourselves wrong. And so you're right. In a real learning organization, everyone learns together, but it begins with you. It begins with me. It begins with the individual.
I love it, Matt. That's great. Thank you very much. I'm very curious, Marisol, what's your reaction to this idea of the learning organization?
Yeah, I think the idea of the learning organization being synonymous with institutionalization as you presented it, what it does for me is it brings clarity, right, to what we're talking about when we talk about institutionalization. I think it's a concept that, like you said, it's elusive. So when you talk about learning organization, what does it really embody? And when we think about all the characteristics that you mentioned, some of those characteristics that lead to institutionalization are embodied in this concept of a learning organization. So you talk about individual and group learning. Now, what I wanted to do is, as I'm thinking about this and hearing you speak, is how do we put this into a practical example? We all know, right, what our vision is. And our vision and shared strategy is to be preeminent in everything that we do. So having a mindset of approaching situations with this sense of urgency and using the opportunity to problem solve and learn from it so that we can prevent problems in the future from occurring will lead to preeminence. So if we use this concept, we can kind of see how those characteristics start coming out about a learning organization. It starts with each one of us, as we all said, individually, internalizing and mastering that ability and that skill set to take this approach in every problem solving situation and share it with others, sharing that knowledge and the insights with the team that is involved in solving those problems, for example. And so that when we're sharing that with the teams, what we're doing in effect is actually functional and cross-functional learning at the same time. When we do that, the functional and cross-functional learning is what we talk about when we talk about integration. So all of these concepts that were from a internalization, integration standpoint, we see it embodied in the learning organization, which then which should lead right to begin becoming embedded in our organization, which then is institutionalization. But as you mentioned, Kit, it's not easy. This is hard. It's quadrant 2 activity. And a lot of times it takes time. It takes a lot of time to really sit back and pause. And our tendency a lot of times is to submit to the demands of our time. And all of this is at the expense most often of reaching profound knowledge. So I like to pose that question to the audience as they sit back and think about this, think about what we're doing, think about what you're doing individually that will contribute to us becoming a learning organization. And with that being said, one other point that this reminds me of, Matt mentioned when he was talking in his remarks about a key insight of organization learning requires an organization of learners. So this brings up another concept that I've been reading about. There was an article that I read titled "An Everyone Culture Becoming a Deliberately Developmental Organization." Now that's a mouthful, right? For short, we call it DDO, but what we're talking about is deliberately developmental organizations. Intriguing, right? So for me, when I think about that, it seems to be the prelude to organizational learning. Why do I say that? Is because a DDO, deliberately developmental organization, is one that is people focused, each person working on themselves. What was pretty insightful and maybe a little bit scary for me in this regard is that these type of organizations, they welcome and embrace people coming into it and deliberately exposing their weaknesses. Scary, right?
Yeah.
If you're, in these type of organizations, you're okay with making your weaknesses public. And in fact, you embrace it, you welcome it. And why? It's because that is going to allow the opportunity for others, your colleagues and others that are working with you, for you to grow and develop. They help you and support you through that process of learning from your weaknesses and developing strengths out of that. So when they're helping you overcome these weaknesses in a collective and collaborative fashion, everyone's learning through that process. So what occurs, it's both individual learning and group learning. And you're starting to hear some of these common themes, right, through all of these different concepts. A deliberately developmental organization is one that's an incubator or an accelerator of people's growth because it eliminates the waste, right, that results from people just spending time just trying to either hide their weaknesses, their limitations, or uncertainties, and they're creating workarounds for them. And this time that and energy that's spent in creating workarounds for hiding their weaknesses instead of confronting them and putting them out in the public so that you can actually work on them is a waste. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of resources for the company, not just for the company, but for the individual himself. And it creates inefficiencies. It creates a lack of productivity. But significantly, by hiding that weakness, you have less chance of overcoming them because you're not really admitting that you have them to begin with. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So the mindset that breeds is trust, transparency, vulnerability, humility, collaboration. And all of these concepts, you've been hearing them through the leadership journey, right? It creates an environment that's open. It's welcoming to giving feedback, receiving feedback. In fact, you want the feedback. And significantly, it integrates people and people development with business development, which I love this concept about doing both things at the same time. So you're leveraging one opportunity with the other opportunity to create business development opportunities while you're developing your people at the same time. When I think about that, I can't help but think about the principles and the learnings that we've all have gone through and we're still learning through leadership journey. If behavior is the function of people in their environment, and the environment is one of trust and of continual learning, then necessarily an organization that's deliberately focused on development of its people will lead to a learning organization. And that in turn starts forming the culture and ultimately leads to institutionalization. The limits of our learning are the limits of our organization. So culture then becomes a culture of learning, an ongoing development journey. So those are some of the things that I would like, the audience to kind of think about. Think about us. Are we a deliberately developmental organization? Do you see us moving into that way, which then ends up for us to be a learning organization? And I'm curious to hear the thoughts that all of you, or both of you, may have on this. Kit, any comments on your behalf?
Yeah. I loved how you tied all those concepts and ideas together, and it's pretty great. I also love the word deliberate or deliberately. I think it's such a powerful word. When you were talking about it, it took me back almost 30 years ago. I had a boss in my life who lived and breathed, and then in turn encouraged us to live. And he stole from Henry David Thoreau the idea of live deliberately. And I couldn't help think of that when you were talking about the tie-in between all of this and the principles. My other thought was we've got to find and have the fortitude to live in quadrant two, to be deliberate in our pursuit of institutionalization, because it's not going to come on its own. It's not going to come. It's not likely ever going to become a quadrant one activity, important and urgent. It's going to stay right in quadrant two, and it's up to us to be different, to differentiate ourselves, and contribute to our organization being, the rare breed that gets to that third eye.
Yeah. Matt, what are your thoughts?
Oh, that was wonderful, Marisol. I completely agree with you. The limits of our learning and development really are the limits of our organization. An organization can only go as far as the people are able and willing to take it. If we get stuck at the integration stage, it's like working part time. But the funny thing is that it always takes up all of our time. Institutionalization really is the next dimension. Institutionalization is where potential and organizational potential and individual potential conjoin, where they kind of come together. That's organizational culture. We've all been pretty much saying the same thing. It boils down to organizational culture. But to get there, the deliberately developmental organization must be protected. It has to be incubated, as it were. Incubation allows the organism to renew itself. and everyone contributes to that. We all become so-called incubators within our organizations, and we sustain this supportive and challenging environment, but we also protect one another by creating psychological safety and also by personifying the principle. So this should not simply be a dream. This has to be a real goal, a dream taken seriously and acted upon. And this takes profound knowledge. The challenge is always knowing enough to think that you are right, but not enough to know you are wrong.
That's
So
very interesting.
I really enjoyed both of your discussions on your topics. They were really extremely insightful. I spent a little bit of time thinking about institutionalization and how it relates to incubation. At the Institute, we talk about changing culture one leader at a time. And that's because it's the only way it ever happens. But sadly, culture has been kind of watered down for mass consumption over the last, I don't know, 20 years. It's been reduced to types. It's been labeled with different types of labels. And it's been simply characterized as the way we do things around here, which is kind of sad.
Mhm.
Today, it's absolutely necessary to understand culture from a new perspective, a new dimension, if you would. One way to do that is to use the concepts of the three I's, the transformational learning process. So the three I's is not only descriptive and prescriptive, but it's also instructive, which is really what's important about it. It contains the what, it contains the how, but it also contains the why. Now you can think about Shine's three levels, the artifacts, the values, and the tacit underlying assumptions as the culture assembly. And then you can think of the three I's as the assembly instructions. Culture really is a verb, an ongoing learning process. So it's the individual internalization of profound knowledge at the motive level, integrated and enacted at the group level, and then institutionalized through cross-functional collaboration and hierarchical alignment. So this describes the social phenomenon of moving from individual consciousness to cultural consciousness, deliberately, intentionally, and consciously. So we say that we need a new dimension because we'll never fully understand culture in the dimension that we currently live in. So if I can use an analogy quickly, we are bounded by our own current knowledge horizon. So it's like being in the ocean in a boat. You look around and you see the horizon, and it's equal around us. It is equal, in any direction that we look, in all directions. We cannot see beyond the knowledge horizon by simply changing our position either in the boat or in the ocean. But if we go up the mast, as it were, above the boat, above the ocean, we now reach a higher dimension. And then our horizon, our knowledge horizon is expanded. So this is all coming together to focus on institutionalization is a learning process. And the process is very delicate. It needs to be protected, incubated. It has to be given a chance to survive so that it can transform ordinary organizations into learning organizations. I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, I think, a lot of times we hear some of these concepts in a normal vernacular of common day. And when I hear incubator, I hear incubation and protected, being protected, culture being protected in that way. I always try to relate it to something in our day-to-day lives so that we can get, a grasp on the concept. The first thing that came to my mind, and not sure if this may sound a little bit ridiculous, but is, when I hear incubator in the past, I'm thinking about new businesses, having an incubation period and where they can test their concepts. And during that concept, during that period where they're trying to incubate a new business, there is this acknowledgement and I guess maybe even an expectation that we're going to go through some failures or we're going to go through some times when we're not quite sure what's being done because it's kind of a testing field. But when we hear about it, it's not a negative connotation that we have when we look at it from the context of business, of starting a new business, an entrepreneur. So why is it that we sometimes think about it as perhaps being negative when it relates to us? And it's not. It's as you said, what we're doing is we're trying to protect and cultivate and welcome those opportunities for failure and learnings to happen during that process. So it's okay, right? It's okay to learn from that. It's okay to nurture those aspects. And when we think about ourselves in that same way, it's easy to understand our role in that transformation process that you're talking about when we talk about our culture and as a learning process, one where we're striving to develop the best version of ourselves, just like a new business. You're trying to cultivate and test their concept to perfect it before they're launching it out into the world, right? As a full-blown business. We want to develop and nurture and cultivate the best version of ourselves through development with the support of others and taking advantage of and leveraging others that are in our organization to support that process and sharing those learnings collectively. I think that's when we start seeing how we become a learning organization, which, as you both have said, is synonymous with institutionalization. Did I capture some of your points there correctly?
Oh, really? Yes, absolutely. That was great. I love the connection. Bringing it into the business world is always very helpful. Kip, what do you think?
Matt, I just have to say I am very grateful and feel like a lucky guy in my late 40s that my path, that you came across my path, our path at this organization. Principles always have existed. What's really great about the work that you've done, you spent your life working on, is that you've gathered them together. And for guys like me and hopefully the rest of my fellow Journey member constituents, it's just been just fabulous, amazing, so helpful for the work that you've put together. I love the idea of the three eyes. It's a great way to conceptualize this idea of moving from our personal responsibility to the team responsibility to the organizational responsibility. I love Ed Shine's stuff on the tacit underlying assumptions. I've literally for 2.5 years been thinking about how can I become more aware of all these assumptions that are below the surface for me that get in the way of my contribution to life, to others, to the organization. So I am just extremely grateful for the work that you've done, and I want to say thank you to you. And I also want to very much thank Marisol for joining our little laboratory discussion today. If I may just finally turn to you as our Leadership Journey members and invite you to consider that on the far edge of craziness, on the other side of complexity, is an opportunity for you and I to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. Until we see you next time, we're going to sign off. I'm Kit Owlitz. See you next time.